Sudan's warring generals agreed to talks in Saudi Arabia as gun battles continue in the capital, Khartoum. Meanwhile, the UN warns of a full-blown catastrophe and that 800,000 people could flee the violence to neighboring countries. Hello, I'm Darren Jordan. This is Aljazera, live from Doha. Also coming up, a barrage of Russian missiles hits Ukraine's railway hubs in the east, killing at least 2 people and wounding over 30. And May Day marches across Latin America. We look at whether the new wave of left-wing leaders is making any progress on labour rights. The UN Sudan envoy says the country's warring generals have agreed to send representatives to talks, possibly in Saudi Arabia. Volker Perthes was speaking to the Associated Press, but he also warned there are challenges to overcome before any negotiations can begin. Well, the fighting between Sudan's army and the paramilitary Rapid Support Forces has now gone on for more than 3 weeks. Monday was another day of airstrikes and explosions despite a shaky ceasefire. The UN's warning the humanitarian crisis in the country is turning into a full-blown catastrophe. Eva Morgan reports from Khartoum.
Sudanese army fighter jets flying over Bahri and East Nile in Sudan's capital Khartoum, targeting positions of the paramilitary Rapid Support Forces. Residents of Bahri in the northern part of the capital say a fuel tanker belonging to the Rapid Support Forces was hit, leaving plumes of dark smoke as heavy gun battle between the two sides raged on for a third week. Other parts of the capital also witnessed intense fighting between the two sides. Hiba is too frightened to leave her apartment in Khartoum.
We hear the sounds of artillery falling in the street. We are traumatized. Every time we hear the fighting, we feel like we will die.
The family is running out of basic supplies.
The Rapid Support Forces are stationed in front of our home, and they won't allow us to fix the electricity pole. There is no electricity and no water.
The UN says the scale and speed of what's unfolding is unprecedented in Sudan. It also says the humanitarian crisis is at a breaking point. The head of the army, General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, has agreed to extend a faltering ceasefire, allowing civilians to leave and aid to be delivered. The paramilitary group, the Rapid Support Forces, have also agreed to the temporary truce. But on the ground, fighting continues, including in Khartoum and its twin city, Omdurman. Local communities in Khartoum warned people to stay at home amidst airstrikes and artillery fire. Millions still remain in the capital, taking opportunities of brief lulls to go and get basic necessities where possible. Those who can make their way out of the capital have already left. Evacuees in Port Sudan say they feel a sense of shock at the sudden spiral into civil war. Many have lived and worked in Sudan for decades.
Sudan is living through a moment of real terror. I'm talking about dead bodies on the streets. We smelled the dead bodies as we were coming to Khartoum. The firing, the shelling, Sudan is seriously in a state of real war.
We hope God brings peace to everyone in Sudan. We are Sudanese people residing in the US. People should not think that Sudan has been destroyed. No, things have happened, but we wish to stay strong.
This group of Somalis arrived in Mogadishu from Port Sudan.
I am pleased that I have finally arrived in my country. However, what we have been through is unusual and hard to describe, but I am grateful for the opportunity to survive.
But for millions of Sudanese, there is nowhere to go. They're trapped by fighting in a country the UN says is falling apart. Hiba Morgan, Aljazera, Khartoum.
In Chad, more than 20,000 people have already crossed the border to seek refuge. They're making the dangerous journey from Sudan on donkeys and by foot. The conflict is also affecting the residents of Chad, with the flow of goods being disrupted, causing food prices to rise. Ahmed Idris reports from Tandalti, West Darfur, on the Sudanese side of the border with Chad.
Right behind me is the local police station here in Tendalti. It is deserted, completely deserted, under lock and key, and it looks like they hurriedly left this place when fighting broke out in Sudan. Over here is a signboard announcing the presence of the police station. It's constructed by the United Nations mission in Darfur and implemented by the Islamic Relief Agency. Many of the residents who fled this town of Tendalti after violence broke out, we understand that a lot of houses have been burned down. Our security forces took to their hills and crossed over along with civilians. Over there is the riverbed, the dry riverbed, which is a crossing point for people who live in this town and now found themselves inside Chad. Now, a lot of people are moving away from this area simply because they feel that it's no longer safe to be here. Now, over there also is the town's courthouse. It's also under lock and key, like many other government establishments here in Tendalti, simply because people don't believe they are safe in this community. If you look at the streets, everything everywhere is empty, except for occasional people, one or two people who come and check on their belongings, their houses, take a bath probably, and then flee across the dry riverbed into Chad. Despite the hardship, they prefer living in open spaces, exposed to the elements, and of course, despite the fact that they don't have enough to eat in those camps. Ahmed Idris, Aljazera from Tendalti, inside Darfur, West Darfur region of Sudan.
At least 2 people have been killed and dozens injured, including children, in a series of Russian missile strikes in Ukraine. Extensive damage was reported in the eastern city of Pavlograd. Charles Stratford has more from the capital, Kyiv.
A massive explosion lights up the night sky over the Pavlograd region in eastern Ukraine. Smoke trails suggest possibly exploding Ukrainian weapons, but not so, say officials, who rarely admit to Russian missiles hitting military targets. They say this was an industrial enterprise and that at least 19 apartment buildings, 25 private homes and 6 schools were damaged or destroyed by the attack. Sergei was at home with his wife when in the early hours of Monday morning there was an almighty blast.
Once I heard the first explosions, I shouted to my wife, "Let's quickly put on clothes and get out." We'd only got to the corridor when I heard another explosion. I was thrown by the shockwave. Windows were blown out. It's good we weren't outdoors because I don't know what would happen to us.
We were in the corridor putting on shoes when both doors were smashed out by the explosion wave. Then there was fire. I ran outside and saw the garage was destroyed.
Ukrainian officials say Russia launched 18 missiles at the Kyiv and Dnipropetrovsk regions, 15 of which were successfully intercepted by air defense. Victoria Supran's daughter lies in bed, lucky to have escaped injury or worse. Officials say dozens of people were injured in the attacks, including children.
We rushed to the hallway and laid on the floor, and then the explosion wave twisted the door. Had we stayed for 5 more seconds, we would have been trapped here. Then there were more explosions. My child will need psychological help. It's horrible.
These attacks come just 3 days after 25 people, including 6 children, were killed by a Russian missile hitting an apartment building in the city of Uman in central Ukraine. Russia repeatedly says it doesn't deliberately target civilians, but thousands have been killed by missiles, drones and shelling of densely populated towns and cities since its invasion of Ukraine in February last year. Russian missiles and so-called kamikaze drone strikes targeting areas deep inside Ukraine have increased in recent days. Now, it's impossible to confirm as to whether these are in fact an attempt by Russia to hit Ukraine's supply lines ahead of an expected Ukrainian counter-offensive. But the UK Defence Ministry says Russia has for months been preparing what it describes as some of the most extensive defensive lines seen anywhere in the world in decades. Charles Stratford, Aljazera, Kyiv.
Syria says one soldier has been killed and 7 others injured by Israeli airstrikes on Aleppo. State media reports that Aleppo airport is out of service following the airstrikes. Several missiles were reportedly intercepted. A United Nations-organized conference on Afghanistan is being held in Qatar amid ongoing concerns over the country's dire humanitarian situation. But the Taliban administration has not been invited to take part in the 2 days of closed-door meetings in Doha. The UN considers Afghanistan its biggest humanitarian crisis. Well, the Taliban's designated ambassador to the UN has issued a statement saying any meeting without its participation is unproductive and even counterproductive. It has a legitimate right to express its position, and he questions how decisions taken can be acceptable or implemented if the Taliban are not part of the process. Finally, it says the move is discriminatory and unjustified and calls for the issues to be solved through a pragmatic approach. Our diplomatic editor, James Bays, has more.
The UN are having a conference here in Doha, and they've not invited the Taliban, and they've not invited the women. The UN, though, say there's a reason for this. And actually, I've just come from New York on a flight from New York, and on the same flight was the UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres. And he made it clear to me that the international community need to be on the same page, and that's the purpose of this meeting, not to engage with the women, not to engage with the Taliban, but to get the international community in the same place, because there are different countries with very different views. Now, one thing that he believes has strengthened the UN's position is at the end of last week, the UN Security Council came up with a resolution condemning the Taliban and its policy towards women, and particularly the ban on female UN workers doing their jobs in Afghanistan. He believes that the first real sign of unity on this issue from the Security Council could mean unity for this meeting, which is with a much wider grouping. It's Western powers, it's regional powers, it's Arab powers, all coming together, and the UN is trying to get them on the same page.
Oh, let's give you some breaking news now. A prominent Palestinian activist, Khaled Adnan, has died in an Israeli prison after 86 days on hunger strike. Adnan was a leading member of Islamic Jihad. He was arrested by Israeli forces near his home in Jenin in early February and has been on hunger strike against his detention without charges. Let's bring in Nida Ibrahim. She's on the line from Ramallah in the occupied West Bank. Nida, what more can you tell us about Khaled Adnan and the events leading up to his death?
Khaled Adnan is a 44-year-old leader of Islamic Jihad Party. He's a father of 9 and spent a total of 8 years in Israeli prisons. Now, while this is not his first hunger strike, we believe it's the 6th. This is the first time he was on hunger strike. 4 charges, actually. He announced his hunger strike the first day he was arrested in February and said that the charges that he's been, the sentence that they're asking for the charges that he's presented with are not compatible. Since then, he started a hunger strike. This was the 86th of his strike. He was found dead in his cell and was moved to the hospital. It's worth mentioning that Khaled Adnan himself was the pioneer who kind of started the series of hunger strikes for Palestinian prisoners as individuals. So in 2012, he started a hunger strike, and he succeeded in ending his detention without charges, basically leading the way for more Palestinian prisoners to go on hunger strike when they're arrested without charges. Now, this time it was different. He was presented with a list of charges, but he said that they are not compatible with the sentence that he was presented with. Now, there has been a strike announced in Jenin and all across the occupied West Bank. We know that 237 Palestinians have been killed or died in Israeli custody since 1967.
Nida, just quickly, is his death likely to lead to an escalation in violence across the West Bank, do you think?
Well, his Islamic Jihad Party has said earlier that if he dies during the hunger strike, it is going to be considered an assassination. And there has been a strike announced in Jenin and all across the occupied West Bank. But it's hard to tell how that death is going to be played out on the street. It all probably depends on Islamic Jihad and what kind of a reaction they're going to have after his death.
Okay, Nida Ibrahim live for us there in Ramallah in the occupied West Bank. Nida, thank you. Time for a short break here in Aljazera. When we come back, an ironclad partnership. Leaders of the US and the Philippines meet as tensions rise over China's growing military and economic might. More on that. Stay with us.